The Lagos Airport Departure Lounge is all glass and marble, a temple of power where Africa's elite move between continents like chess pieces. Zainab Okafor sits motionless in a leather chair, her locks draped over one shoulder, fingers wrapped around a coffee she hasn't touched. Her gold cuff catches the light. Beside her, positioned at a calculated distance, Min-Joon Kim stands with his hands at his sides, his gaze fixed on the crowd, never on her. He hasn't looked at her directly in 6 months. It's been exactly 1,847 days since he was hired to protect her. She built an empire on the premise that power is solitary. He was trained on the principle that protection requires distance. They were a perfect match. Two people fluent in the language of boundaries, speaking only when necessary, existing in a space where duty had completely consumed desire. But something has shifted. It started small. A hesitation in her stride when he entered a room. A fraction of a second where his scanning eyes lingered on her face instead of the exits. The smallest cracks in the armor they'd both perfected. Now, in the time it takes for a boarding announcement, Min-Joon makes a choice that will cost him everything he's ever been. She will find a letter in her office drawer, written in perfect English, signed only with initials. He will disappear from his post during the most critical moment, leaving her unprotected at a summit where every player wants her destroyed. The world will believe he chose money. They will believe he was bribed. They will never believe he chose love. But the truth is far more dangerous. He didn't choose at all. The choice chose him the moment he realized that protecting her from the world meant nothing if he couldn't protect her from herself. In a world where power demands you stand alone, what happens when the one person whose job is to remain at a distance becomes the only person you cannot live without? What if the greatest threat to her empire isn't her enemies, but her own heart? And what if his betrayal was actually the most loyal thing he could have ever done? She will lose her company, her reputation, her throne. He will lose his identity, his honor, his country. Together, they might lose everything. But the real question isn't whether love is worth the sacrifice. The real question is, once you've tasted what it means to be truly seen by another human being, how do you go back to being invisible? This is not a love story about two people finding each other. This is a love story about two people learning that some oaths are more binding than any contract, and some betrayals are actually the truest forms of loyalty. This is a story about what happens when the person hired to save you becomes the person worth losing everything for. And about whether that's a tragedy or a revolution. Before we dive into this story, tell us where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is right now. Someone near you might be watching too. And don't forget to subscribe to support and appreciate the work we do on this channel. The morning Zainab Okafor learned that her third marriage had ended was also the morning she signed the largest acquisition in Okafor Tech's history. The divorce papers arrived via email at 6:47 a.m., her Lagos time, well before her London legal team would have received them. Her lawyer, a meticulous woman named Patricia, had written, "He's being amicable about the settlement. You won't even need to be present for the proceedings." Zainab had read the email twice, felt absolutely nothing, and moved directly to her calendar. The acquisition, a German software company worth $847 million, required her signature on the dotted line by noon. She wore the burgundy suit. Not for confidence, though she had enough of that. The color was simply more honest. Burgundy was the color of things ending. The first time she'd met Min-Joon Kim, she'd barely noticed him. This was her mistake, though she wouldn't recognize it as one until much later. It was a Tuesday in September, 3 years ago. Okafor Tech had gone public the year before, which meant security protocols that made Zainab feel like she was living inside a prison guard's fantasy. Her previous bodyguard, a massive Nigerian man named Chidi who'd been with her since the early days, had retired after his daughter was born. Zainab had been genuinely sad about this. Chidi had spoken to her, had treated her like a person rather than an asset to be protected. But she'd learned long ago that people are temporary. Companies endure. Empires endure. Everything else is sentiment. The security firm had sent 3 candidates. All men. All interchangeable in the way that security personnel are supposed to be. Blank slates designed to blend into backgrounds. 2 of them she'd dismissed immediately. One had the nervous energy of someone compensating for doubt. The other had the arrogance of someone who'd worked for warlords and drug lords, and thought that made him interesting. Minjun Kim had simply stood there. He was small, by bodyguard standards. Compact. When she'd asked him to walk her from one end of her office to the other, he'd moved with a fluidity that was almost absurd. He didn't escort her. He anticipated her. 3 steps before she changed direction, he was already repositioning. 3 steps before she reached for a door, his hand was already moving. "How did you know I was going to?" she'd started. "I don't know," he'd interrupted, his English perfect, his accent a soft undertone. "I watch. I adjust. I respond before you need me to." She'd hired him on the spot. For 6 months, he was invisible. This was exactly what she'd wanted. He arrived at 5 a.m. when she arrived at 5:15 a.m. He positioned himself in restaurants such that she didn't have to see him. He somehow knew every threat before it materialized. The would-be protester outside her office building in Lagos, the fake journalist in Accra who was actually an industrial spy, the ex-colleague bitter about his termination who'd tried to access her calendar. He'd handled each situation with a quietness that left no mess, no scandal, no international incident. Zainab had, in 6 months, spoken perhaps 200 words to him. This suited them both perfectly. Her empire was built on a simple philosophy: never let anyone close enough to hurt you. She'd learned this from her father, a man who'd made his fortune in oil, and then promptly abandoned his family when the fortune became comfortable enough to start over elsewhere. She'd learned it again from her first husband, who'd married her for the perception of power, while actively working to dismantle the reality of it. She'd learned it a 3rd time from her second husband, who'd fathered a child with her business partner, while she was in New York securing a Series C funding round. By the time the 3rd husband's betrayal arrived via email, Zainab had elevated her emotional architecture to an art form. The walls weren't just high anymore. They were structural. They were load-bearing. They were the only thing holding anything up. Minjun's walls, she would later understand, were built differently. His were not the walls of someone protecting against betrayal. They were the walls of someone who'd been trained to believe that he didn't deserve to want anything in the first place. He'd joined the Korean military at 18, following a family tradition that spanned generations. His father had been a captain. His grandfather had been killed in the Korean War. His great-grandfather had served the last emperor. The Kim family understood protection the way other families understood dinner. It was simply what you did. It was what you were born to do. But the military, he'd discovered, was not quite demanding enough. By 25, he'd been recruited into the Presidential Security Service, a division so classified that it didn't technically exist. He'd undergone training that most people would consider torture, but that the PSS classified simply as preparation. He'd learned 17 different combat disciplines. He'd learned to operate weapons that hadn't been publicly acknowledged as existing. He'd learned to compartmentalize his mind in ways that would probably result in an interesting conversation with a therapist, if he'd ever had access to one. The PSS taught a philosophy that was simple: your life is not yours. Your body is not yours. Your will is not yours. You are a vessel for duty, and duty is the only thing that matters. Minjun had been exceptional at this philosophy. He'd taken the obsessive precision that was genetic in his family, and the emotional repression that was cultural in his country, and synthesized them into something that was, by the metrics of his employers, perfect. He'd taken a bullet for a politician once. The politician had survived. Minjun still had the scar on his ribs. A thin line he sometimes pressed his fingers against when he was alone, the way other people might check their pulse to confirm they're still alive. He'd prevented 3 assassination attempts. He'd never, in his entire career, allowed personal feeling to interfere with duty. Then his ex-wife had asked him for a divorce. This had been unexpected, not because his marriage was happy. He'd married because the PSS recommended it, to a woman his mother had chosen, to whom he spoke perhaps 200 words a year, but because she'd asked him face to face, in their apartment, and in that moment he'd realized he'd never looked at her. Not really. Not the way you're supposed to look at another human being. He'd looked at her the way he looked at every aspect of his environment, as a variable to be managed, A piece on a board to be considered within the larger strategy. He was 33 years old before he understood that his efficiency had cost him his own life. The divorce had been finalized quickly. She'd been kind about it, which somehow made it worse. He'd left the PSS 3 months later, not because he couldn't do the work anymore, but because he suddenly understood that doing the work meant he would never be alive. He would only ever be operational. The private security contract with Zeynep Okafor's firm had been a deliberate step backward. Lower stakes. Less life or death. Just protection, clean and simple and professional. What he hadn't anticipated was that she would test every single wall he'd ever built. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday in March. Zeynep had a board meeting that ran 13 hours. 13 hours of men in suits questioning her decisions, suggesting alternatives, implying through their careful language that a woman's instincts couldn't be trusted the way a man's could. By hour 11, her voice had taken on a metallic quality, sharp and bright and completely empty of feeling. She'd closed the meeting with a decision that would save the company 4 billion naira, but that would require laying off 2,000 people in their Lagos facility. It was the right decision. It was the only decision. It was also the kind of decision that makes your hands shake when no one is watching. Minjun had been standing by the window, as he always did, positioned to see both the room and the corridor beyond. He'd noticed her hands shaking at hour 7. By hour 13, when she stood to leave, he'd already run through 17 different possibilities in his mind. Hypoglycemia, medication interaction, early signs of tremor-related disease. He'd prepared a private medic to be on standby. But when she walked past him toward the elevator, and for just a fraction of a second her composure cracked, her jaw tightened, her eyes closed, her breathing hitched, he understood that it wasn't medical. It was human. He'd followed her into the private elevator, as was protocol. She'd stood in the corner, still in her burgundy suit, and she'd put her face in her hands. Minjun had made a choice in that moment that violated every protocol he'd ever been taught. He'd pressed the emergency stop button. "You made the right choice," he'd said. His voice was quiet. "The layoffs will save the company. The company provides employment for 12,000 other people. Their livelihoods depend on your decision. You did the right thing." Zeynep had looked at him then. Really looked at him. The way he'd looked at his ex-wife's face and seen, for the first time, another human being. "How do you know that?" she'd asked. "I read the reports," he'd said, which wasn't the full truth. The full truth was that he'd watched her face every single meeting for 6 months. He'd learned her tells. He knew that when she touched the corner of her mouth, she was thinking about human cost. When she straightened her shoulders, she was preparing to be the person other people needed her to be. When she looked out the window like that, she was looking for someone to tell her that she was still a good person despite the decisions she had to make. "Thank you," she'd whispered. He'd restarted the elevator without responding. Some words, once spoken, changed the geometry of every space they enter. It took 2 more months before anything overtly shifted. The second crack was deeper. Zeynep had a press conference in Johannesburg regarding a proposed expansion into South Africa. It should have been straightforward. A technology company moving into a new market, jobs created, investment flowing, the usual machinery of capitalism humming along. But there was an environmental activist group that had taken issue with one of their manufacturing partners. They'd organized a protest. They'd made the narrative complicated. She'd arrived at the press conference venue at 10:47 a.m. on a Thursday. The protesters had begun arriving at 10:15 a.m. By 11:00 a.m., there were 300 of them. And by Minjun's calculation, at least 27 individuals in the crowd who had the posture and movement patterns of people who'd been trained in methods designed to escalate situations from protest to violence. He'd made the call to evacuate, not to cancel the press conference. That would look like surrender, and Zeynep's public perception didn't have room for surrender, but to exit through a service entrance and find an alternate route to the stage. The protesters had found them anyway. The moment was captured by multiple cameras from multiple angles. It would later play on news cycles globally. Zeynep Okafor, CEO of the fastest-growing tech company in Africa, being physically jostled by college-aged environmental activists while her security detail attempted to clear a path. her suit torn at the shoulder, her locks coming loose from their careful arrangement. And in the middle of the chaos, Minjun had done something that violated every protocol about protective detail. Instead of maintaining his position at her 7 o'clock, he'd moved directly in front of her, his body a shield between her and the crowd. He'd taken a hit meant for her shoulder on his ribs. He'd absorbed the momentum that would have knocked her down. For 7 seconds, he'd stopped being her security detail and started being someone who cared whether she survived the day. The footage had gone viral. The headline spun it exactly as intended. Tech CEO's bodyguard shows unwavering loyalty. Okafor Tech security detail protects CEO in tense Johannesburg incident. But the photograph that had been pulled from the video footage was far more telling. Minjun's hand on her arm. Her face turned toward him. The expression on both their faces suggesting that for just a moment, they were the only two people in the world. That night, in the hotel in Johannesburg, Zainab had called him to her suite. This violated protocol. Security details maintained distance. They didn't enter private spaces. You shouldn't have done that, she'd said. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, still in the torn suit, her shoulder bearing the bruise that was already blooming purple and black. I did my job, he'd replied, standing by the door, maintaining distance. You did more than your job, she'd said. I saw the footage. In that moment she'd stopped, unable to articulate what she'd seen, which was a man choosing to protect her at the expense of his professional credibility. It doesn't matter, he'd said. But they both knew that it did. The third crack was the deepest. For months after Johannesburg, Zainab's company faced its first real crisis. An engineer in their Lagos facility, a man named bodyguard.The, had discovered a security vulnerability in their primary system. He'd wanted to report it through proper channels, to her chief technology officer, then to the board, then to the public with appropriate acknowledgement and remediation steps. This was the right approach. It was also the approach that would have cost Okafor Tech 4 billion naira in market value, and resulted in multiple lawsuits. Bodyguard hadn't reported it through channels. Instead, he'd taken his evidence to a journalist. The journalist had published the story. Zainab had 48 hours to decide. Acknowledge the vulnerability, damage the company's reputation but appear transparent and ethical, or deny the vulnerability, call the engineer a disgruntled former employee. She'd have to fire him, of course, to make this stick, and hope the lie held. She'd spent those 48 hours in her office working. Not sleeping. Barely eating. Just sitting at her desk, looking at spreadsheets and projections, trying to calculate the exact weight of her own conscience. On the morning of the second day, as she was preparing the statement that would secure the lie, Minjun had entered her office, unannounced, which he never did, and placed a USB drive on her desk. What is this? She'd asked. The source code, he'd said. Verified. Checked by an independent auditor I hired with my own money. The vulnerability exists. It's serious. You could patch it within 72 hours if you start immediately. She'd stared at him. How did you? Why would you? Because I've spent 3 years protecting your body, he'd said. But who protects your soul? He'd turned and left before she could respond. Zainab had made the call that day. She'd acknowledged the vulnerability. She'd publicly fired Bodyguard. Not because he'd violated company policy, but because the appearance of doing so would help the narrative. She'd announced a company-wide security overhaul. Okafor Tech's stock had dipped 8.3% in the first hour and then, over the following week, had climbed higher than it had ever been, because the market respected a company that could tell the truth and survive it. That evening, she'd requested a private meeting with Minjun. They'd met in the executive parking garage, because privacy was becoming a currency they both suddenly needed to trade in. She'd stood with her back against her car, still in her work clothes, and she'd said, "You violated your protocols today. You investigated company operations. You spent your own resources. You influenced a major business decision without authorization." "I know," he'd said. "Why?" she'd asked. He'd looked at her then, really looked at her, the way she'd been learning to look at him. And she'd understood that the question wasn't actually about why he'd done it. The question was about everything else. Why he'd become someone who would do it. Why she'd become someone who would let him. Why the space between them, that had been empty for so long, had begun to fill with something neither of them had been trained to name. Because I can't protect you from yourself, he'd finally said. But I can protect you from becoming someone you don't recognize. The thing about proximity is that it compounds over time. Every shared look becomes a language. Every moment of silence becomes something you're both conspiring to create. By the end of that summer, Zainab and Minjun had built an entire communication system that existed entirely beneath the surface of their professional relationship. It started with coffee. She'd always taken hers at 5:47 a.m., before anyone else arrived at the office, 20 minutes after she'd showered, 15 minutes before she'd review the overnight market reports. Minjun had always arrived at 5:15 a.m. to secure the premises. 6 months into this routine, he'd begun having her coffee ready at 5:45 a.m., sitting on her desk, exact temperature, exact amount of cream. She'd never asked him how he knew. Then it became breakfast. The mornings when the board meeting started at 8 a.m. The mornings when she was anxious, though she'd never admit to anxiety, he would position himself in the office kitchenette at 6:30 a.m. and make a simple scrambled egg with toast. Never fancy. Never presumptuous. Just enough. He'd leave it on the counter with a small napkin, and she'd eat it while reviewing her talking points, and they'd never discuss it. Then it became the way he'd adjust the temperature in her office when he noticed her shoulders tightening. The way he'd position the screen on her desk to reduce glare when she was reading dense contracts. The way he'd clear the elevator of other people, when he could tell from her breathing that she needed silence. It became the way she'd started checking his posture from across rooms. The way she'd began noticing when he'd sustained a minor injury. The careful way he'd move his left shoulder in late July. The barely perceptible wince when he'd think no one was watching. The way she'd deliberately schedule lighter days when she could sense he was running on empty. What they were building was not a relationship. Relationships require conversation, vulnerability, mutual investment in each other's interior lives. What they were building was something that existed in the negative space. In the things not said, in the time not spent together, in the absolute maintenance of professional distance that somehow became the most intimate thing either of them had ever experienced. By August, every interaction had begun to feel like a small betrayal of their stated positions. The first overt crack came during a conference in Dubai. Zainab was being honored as one of the 50 most influential women entrepreneurs in Africa. The event was held at the Emirates Palace, all marble and gold, and the kind of air conditioning that convinced you that climate wasn't something that happened outside. She was scheduled to speak on the second night, after a dinner and before drinks at a private lounge on the 47th floor. Minjun had done the security sweep the day before. He'd identified every exit, every potential vulnerability, every sightline. He'd positioned himself in the ballroom at 6:47 p.m., exactly when the first guests arrived. Zainab had entered at 7:03 p.m. in a dress that was simultaneously the most conservative and the most striking thing she'd ever worn. Black silk that moved like water, with a deep V-neck and no back at all. Her locks were arranged in an intricate crown, studded with small diamonds. She'd looked like power incarnate. And for exactly 3 seconds, Minjun had forgotten his job was to protect her. His job in that moment had been to breathe. He'd noticed her noticing that he'd noticed her. Their eyes had met across the ballroom, just for a moment, just enough time for them to understand that something had shifted in the equilibrium. The professional distance had suddenly become a choice instead of a default. They were maintaining it now, not because protocol demanded it, but because the alternative would destroy everything. The dinner had been excruciating. Zainab had sat at a table with the Minister of Commerce, 3 other CEOs, and the wife of a European investment banker. She'd spoken intelligently about market expansion and economic development, and the future of technology in emerging economies. She'd smiled at exactly the right moments. She'd been perfect. But Minjun, standing exactly 17 feet away, had been able to see the small flutter in her breathing when she'd drunk her water. The way her fingers had trembled slightly when she'd reached for her fork. The way her eyes had kept finding his across the room, even as she'd been discussing quarterly earnings with the Minister of Commerce. By the time she'd delivered her speech 2 hours later, They were both operating at a frequency of awareness that was unsustainable. She'd spoken about ambition and sacrifice. She'd spoken about the price of power. She'd spoken about the women who'd made her possible. Her mother, her grandmother, the lineage of strength that had been encoded into her DNA. And Minjun had understood in that moment that she was speaking in a code that only he could decipher. Every word was both about her company and about something else entirely. Something that required him to be standing in this ballroom instead of anywhere else in the world. After the speech, the event had moved to the private lounge on the 47th floor. Zainab had circulated, accepting congratulations, making connections, doing the work of empire maintenance. Minjun had maintained his position by the window, watching the city lights stretch out beneath them like a map of all the places they would never go together. At 11:47 p.m., Zainab had excused herself to the restroom. Minjun had, against every protocol, followed her. The hallway outside the lounge was empty. The private restroom was around a corner, out of sight of the main space. He'd positioned himself to give her privacy while maintaining security parameters. When she'd emerged, she'd stopped. "You shouldn't be here," she'd said. "I know," he'd replied. "This is unprofessional." "I know. If anyone sees this, it could." "I know." She'd looked at him then, standing in that hallway in an expensive dress in a hotel 47 floors above the city, and she'd said, "What are we doing?" He hadn't answered immediately. They'd stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, and finally he'd said, "I don't know. But I know that I can't keep doing this." "Doing what?" she'd asked, though she knew. They both knew. "Standing 17 feet away from you and pretending it's not destroying me." The words had hung in the air between them like something physical, something that could break if either of them moved wrong. "We can't," she'd started. "I know," he'd said. "I understand the protocols. I understand the professional risks. I understand everything you're about to tell me about why this is impossible." "And yet," she'd asked. "And yet," he'd repeated, "I'm still standing here." She'd turned back toward the lounge, and he'd stepped aside to let her pass. They'd both returned to the event separately, maintaining the distance, pretending the conversation hadn't happened. But everything had changed. The psychological shift that followed was subtle but total. Where before they'd been managing proximity, they were now managing desire. Where before they'd maintained professional distance as a default, they were now maintaining it as an active choice, which meant every moment of separation became a small act of defiance. Zainab started staying later at the office, knowing he'd be there. Minjun started arriving earlier, knowing she'd be there. They'd find ways to be alone. In elevators that mysteriously became empty when she entered. In conference rooms they'd schedule back-to-back meetings, and even when there was no business to conduct. In the parking garage late at night when no one was watching. They never touched. Not once. Not even accidentally. The discipline of non-touch became its own form of intimacy. But they began to talk. Actually talk. Not about business or security protocols or quarterly projections. They talked about childhoods. About expectations and the weight of lineage. About the specific loneliness of being the person everyone depends on. Zainab told him about her father leaving, about her first husband's infidelities, about the third divorce that had arrived via email. She told him about the moment she'd realized that her company was the only thing that would never abandon her, which was how she'd become someone who loved it more than she loved people. Minjun told her about the PSS, about being trained to have no interior life, about the moment he'd realized that efficiency and aliveness are incompatible. He told her about his ex-wife's face, about the shame of having lived with someone and never truly seen them. "Why are you telling me this?" she'd asked one night. In her office after everyone had left, the city stretched out behind them like a kingdom she'd built, and then discovered was hollow. "Because I can't protect you if I don't know what you're protecting yourself from," he'd said. "That's not your job," she'd said. "No," he'd agreed. "But somewhere along the way, my job stopped being the thing that mattered most." By September, the external pressures had begun to mount. The board was noticing that Minjun had become more visible than was typical for a security detail. He'd started attending some high-level meetings, not as a bodyguard but as a voice in strategy discussions. This was technically justified. He developed superior threat assessment capabilities and had valuable input on risk mitigation. But it was also a boundary violation that the board was beginning to question. More dangerously, the media had begun to notice. A society columnist for a Lagos publication had written a piece about the obvious chemistry between Zainab Okafor and her bodyguard. She'd been gentle about it, couching it in language that was more observation than accusation. But the implication was clear. People were noticing that something was happening in the space between them. Zainab had read the column and felt the first real tremor of fear. This was not something she could control. This was not a business decision that could be managed through strategic communication. This was a story that, once it gained traction, would develop its own narrative momentum. She could already see the headlines. CEO's objectivity compromised by personal relationship with security detail. Does nepotism at the highest levels of Okafor Tech? Bodyguard's unprecedented access raises questions about conflicts of interest. Any one of those headlines could undermine everything she'd built. So she did what she'd always done when faced with existential threat. She created distance. She began arriving at the office at 7:30 a.m. instead of 5:15 a.m., which meant Minjun wouldn't already be there. She started taking meetings outside the office, which meant he'd have to maintain formal security protocols instead of being in the room. She began answering his emails with single words. She began treating him, in public and in private, with the kind of professional cordiality that was designed to communicate that nothing was happening and nothing would happen. Minjun understood what she was doing. He understood that she was protecting the company, protecting both their reputations, doing what leaders do when confronted with unsustainable situations. But understanding didn't make it hurt any less. The internal conflict became unbearable. For Zainab, the choice was between the company she'd built and the first person who'd ever made her feel like she didn't have to be perfect to be worthy. For Minjun, the choice was between the oath he'd taken and the first person who'd ever made him feel like being empty and efficient wasn't the highest calling a human being could achieve. They existed in a state of constant tension. Every time they were in the same room, their bodies registered each other with the sensitivity of instruments designed to measure infinitesimal shifts. Every time they weren't in the same room, there was a silence between them that felt like mourning. By late October, the public pressure had intensified. An American business magazine had published a full profile on Zainab, and in it, there was a full paragraph about her mysterious and devoted security detail. Her competitors were beginning to weaponize the narrative, suggesting that perhaps her judgment was compromised by personal attachment. It was getting worse, not better. And they both knew it. The turning point came on a Tuesday evening, in November, at the United Nations Economic and Social Council meeting in New York. Zainab had been invited to speak on the role of technology in sustainable development. It was the kind of stage that mattered. World leaders, major institutional actors, the kind of platform that could cement her legacy beyond just business. She'd prepared for weeks. The speech was 7 minutes long and had taken 40 hours to write. Every word had been considered. Every pause had been calculated. Minjun had accompanied her to New York, as he always did. He'd done the security sweep at the UN headquarters. He'd identified the 17 most probable threats. He'd positioned backup security and had contingency routes mapped for every scenario. What he hadn't anticipated was what was going to happen during the speech itself. Zainab had begun speaking at 4:17 p.m., her locks arranged in their corporate crown, her voice carrying across the assembly with the authority of someone who'd spent years learning to fill spaces with sound. She'd discussed technological innovation. She'd discussed economic opportunity. She'd discussed the potential for emerging markets to leapfrog traditional development models and create new paradigms entirely. And then, without warning, she'd deviated from her prepared text. Technology is only as valuable as the humanity that implements it, she'd said, and Minjun had recognized the moment. That was a line he'd said to her once in her office, when they were supposed to be discussing threat assessment protocols. We build systems and architecture, and we forget that the systems are built to serve people. We forget that every line of code, every algorithm, every data point represents a human life. She'd paused, and he could see her hands trembling slightly on the podium. I have spent the last 3 years building an empire of technology, she continued. I have made decisions that have affected millions of lives. And I have operated under the assumption that success means isolation. That the more you sacrifice of yourself, the stronger your company becomes. But I have learned recently that this assumption is wrong. I have learned that the most valuable thing any of us can be is honest. Honest about our limitations. Honest about our needs. Honest about the fact that we cannot build anything of lasting value while standing completely alone. Minjun had gone completely still. This wasn't in the prepared remarks. This was her speaking directly to him, in a speech watched by 1,200 people, broadcast to an international audience of millions. She'd made her choice. The remainder of her speech had been technically flawless, but the moment of deviation had changed everything. Every word after that had been understood by those who could read her face as confirmation of something personal, something that went beyond technology or business or the traditional frameworks of corporate leadership. When she'd stepped down from the podium, she'd looked directly at him. Not discreetly. Not in the coded way they'd been communicating for months. Directly. With intention. The media, of course, had picked up on it immediately. By the time she'd reached her hotel, her phone had been flooded with interview requests from journalists who'd seen the footage. The narrative was being written in real time. CEO's personal struggles interrupt UN speech. Is Okafor Tek's leader cracking under pressure? Zainab Okafor's emotional breakdown at United Nations raises questions. But more dangerously, the speculation had began about what, exactly, had caused the deviation. The Society columnist who'd written about their chemistry, months earlier had already published a follow-up piece suggesting that the speech was a public declaration of romantic involvement. The piece was careful, nothing defamatory, nothing that couldn't be defended against. But it was clear that the time for secrecy was ending. Minjun had entered her suite at the hotel without being asked, which violated protocol, and he'd said, "We need to have a conversation about what just happened." "I know," she'd replied. "You deviated from your speech. You made a personal statement in a professional forum. You looked directly at me while doing it." "I know. The media is already speculating. By tomorrow morning, we'll have confirmation of what everyone is beginning to suspect. Your board will demand an explanation. Your competitors will use it as ammunition. Your investors will question your stability." She turned away from him, walking to the window of her hotel suite, looking out at New York at night, that impossible city that somehow contains multitudes. "I'm aware of the consequences," she'd said quietly. "And yet," he'd asked, though he knew the answer. He was beginning to understand that she'd known what she was doing when she deviated from the speech. She'd made a choice. She'd chosen him. "I got to a certain point," she'd said, "and I realized that I could spend the rest of my life protecting the empire, or I could spend the rest of my life protecting myself from you. And I discovered that I don't actually want either of those things anymore." Minjun had done what he should have done. He should have created distance. He should have submitted his resignation. He should have walked out of that hotel room and never looked back, because his continued presence would only make things worse. Instead, he'd done what he'd been trained never to do. He'd chosen love over duty. He'd walked to where she was standing and he'd looked at her face, and he'd said, "I'm going to betray my oath. I'm going to do the thing that I was trained to believe makes a person worthless. And I need you to understand that once I do this, there's no going back to what I was before." "I know," she'd said. "You're about to lose everything." "I know." He'd stepped closer, and the space between them, that space they'd maintained so carefully for so long, had finally closed. The kiss had lasted exactly 4 seconds, and in those 4 seconds, both of them had felt the moment where they transformed from being two people managing desire into being two people who'd already made the choice to surrender to it. What followed was not passion in the conventional sense. It was something quieter and more devastating. It was two people who'd spent their entire lives learning to be invulnerable, discovering that the only vulnerability that mattered was this. Choosing another human being over everything else. They hadn't slept. They'd spent the night talking, and in that talking, they'd both understood the weight of what they were choosing. By the time dawn had broken over New York, they'd already begun to comprehend the cost. By 8:47 a.m. the next morning, the first official confirmation came from a board member who'd been contacted by a journalist asking for comment. The board member, a woman named Alma Mensah who'd been with Okafor since the series of funding round, had responded to the journalist with a carefully worded statement. Ms. Okafor's personal relationships are entirely her own business. What matters is her leadership of this company. It was the kind of statement designed to acknowledge without confirming, to protect without lying. But the moment the article published, Okafor board member refuses to deny CEO's romantic relationship with Bodyguard. The story had achieved critical mass. By noon, Zainab's phone had been ringing constantly. Her chief financial officer wanted to discuss the impact on investor confidence. Her chief technology officer wanted to know if her judgment had been compromised on technical decisions. Her publicist wanted to schedule immediate crisis management meetings. And then the email had arrived from her chief operating officer, a man named Okonkwo who'd been with her since the beginning. The board has scheduled an emergency meeting for Friday. Attendance mandatory. Bring legal representation. This was when Zainab fully understood the consequences of her choice. She'd known intellectually that there would be fallout. She'd known, theoretically, that her personal decisions would affect her professional position. But knowing and experiencing were different things. Knowing existed in the abstract. Experiencing was the sensation of watching everything you'd built begin to crack. Minjun had understood his consequences differently. When security firms discover that their operatives have become romantically involved with their clients, there is only one acceptable response: termination. Not because of moral judgment. Most agencies understood that proximity breeds connection. But because the professional relationship has been irreparably compromised. A bodyguard cannot objectively assess threats to someone they've emotionally invested in. A security detail cannot maintain the distance necessary for clear threat assessment once that distance has been violated. By Wednesday morning, the agency had called him. "You understand what needs to happen," the director had said. Not a question. A statement. "I do," Minjun had replied. "You'll submit your resignation immediately." "Yes." "You'll turn over all access credentials and information." "Yes." "And you'll cease all contact with the client, effective immediately." This was when Minjun had made a choice that violated his training in a way that was even more fundamental than falling in love had been. He'd paused before responding. And in that pause, he'd decided that his training was optional. "No," he'd said. "I won't do that." "Then you're in breach of your contractual obligations." "I understand. We will pursue legal action." "I understand," he'd repeated. And that was how it had ended. Not with a conversation or a negotiation or a ceremony of any kind, but with Minjun deciding that his duty to the woman he loved was greater than his duty to the organization that had defined him. By Thursday, the story had leaked internationally. Every major business publication had picked it up. The headlines were predictable. African tech CEO's judgment called into question after romantic involvement with security detail. Is Okafor-Tech's leadership compromised? Bodyguard breaks protocol in relationship with CEO client. What was less predictable were the responses from the public. A significant portion of the commentary was supportive. Women, particularly, seemed to understand the radical act of what Zainab had done. The choice to prioritize her own humanity over her corporate image. There were think pieces about the gendered standards of leadership, about the way women leaders are condemned for emotional decisions that men leaders are praised for. There were essays about the cost of perfection and the value of vulnerability, but there were also investors calling for her removal. There were board members questioning her fitness for the role. There were analysts downgrading Okafor-Tech's stock, not because the company's fundamentals had changed, but because the CEO had proven herself capable of making decisions based on personal preference rather than corporate benefit. By Friday morning, when the board meeting was scheduled to begin, Zainab had already decided what she was going to do. She'd spent the night before the meeting alone, which was where she'd wanted to be. She needed to think clearly, without Minjun's presence to distract or comfort her. She'd needed to understand what she actually valued, and what she was willing to sacrifice for it. The conclusion she'd reached was simple. She couldn't have both. She couldn't have Minjun and Okafor. The company demanded a leader who could pretend that she was built differently than other humans, that she didn't need love or connection or the kind of vulnerability that Minjun had shown her. The company demanded that she stay perfect, stay isolated, stay above reproach. But here was the thing about power that no one tells you until you've already spent everything to acquire it. Once you have it, you discover that it's not actually what you wanted. What you wanted was to matter. What you wanted was to be seen. What you wanted, it turned out, was exactly what Minjun had offered her in that hallway in Dubai, in that elevator after the 13-hour meeting, in every moment when he'd chosen her over protocol. So she'd made her decision. When she walked into the board meeting, she was not defensive. She was not apologetic. She was simply clear. I understand that my personal relationship with my former security detail has become an issue, she'd said. I understand that it raises questions about my judgment. I understand that it complicates your confidence in my leadership. She'd paused, looking at each board member directly. I also understand, she'd continued, that my role as CEO requires me to make decisions based on what's best for the company. And I believe that what's best for the company at this moment is a transition in leadership. The room had gone silent. I'm not being forced out, she clarified. I'm choosing to step down. I will remain as chair of the board, but I will be appointing a new CEO who can operate without the personal complications that my situation has created. This is not a failure of leadership. This is a recognition that the company's needs have evolved, and my continued service as CEO, given the current circumstances, would be a distraction. The board had been stunned. They'd tried to talk her out of it. They'd offered compromises, solutions, ways to manage the narrative that would have allowed her to stay in power. But Zainab had made her choice, and she was unwavering in it. By the end of the meeting, she'd arranged her own replacement, and had scheduled a public announcement for the following morning. By the time she'd left that boardroom, she was no longer the CEO of Okafor. She was something she'd never been before. A woman who'd chosen love over power, and accepted the consequences of that choice. When she'd found Minjun later that evening, waiting in her office, knowing she'd look for him there, she'd simply said, I chose you. He'd looked at her with an expression that combined joy and devastation in equal measure. You chose the company, he'd said. You built it with your hands. You sacrificed everything for it. No, she'd replied. I chose someone who told me that I was worth protecting even when it cost him everything. I chose someone who broke his oath for me. I chose someone who made me believe that being vulnerable wasn't the same as being weak. What they were standing on, at that moment, was not the ruin of her empire. It was something far more fragile and far more valuable. The foundation of a life built on the choice to prioritize each other over everything else. The real consequences would come later. The lawsuits, the scandal, the years of rebuilding credibility, the understanding that they'd both given up things that could never be reclaimed. But in that moment, standing in the office she'd built and was now leaving behind, Zainab Okafor finally understood what power actually meant. Not the ability to command empires, but the ability to surrender everything and survive it. Not the strength to never fall, but the courage to fall, and then get back up with another person by your side. Minjun had taught her that the most dangerous thing a person can do is become truly seen by another human being. And she'd discovered that she was willing to lose everything for the chance to be seen, fully and completely, for the rest of her life. The story of the African CEO and her Korean bodyguard wasn't a love story, not exactly. It was the story of two people learning that the oaths they'd been taught to honor, duty, discipline, the suppression of self, were less binding than the promise they'd made to each other without ever speaking a word. It was the story of what happens when the person hired to keep you safe becomes the person you'd risk everything to protect. The global financial markets registered the news within 17 minutes. Okafor stock, which had been trading at 847 naira per share on Thursday, opened Monday morning at 612. This was not a crash, it was a reckoning. Investors understood, with the precision that markets employ when assessing risk, that a company loses approximately 27.7% of its value when its founder and CEO voluntarily steps down due to a personal scandal. But the numbers didn't capture the real story. In London, where Okafor maintained its European headquarters, the financial press erupted with commentary. The Financial Times published a measured analysis titled, "When Personal Becomes Professional: The Okafor Leadership Transition." But the tabloids were less generous. The Daily Mail ran with betrayal at the top. Why an African tech CEO threw away her empire for a bodyguard. The language was designed to wound, to suggest not that Zainab had made a difficult choice, but that she'd been foolish enough to believe that love could compete with the imperative of capital accumulation. In Lagos, the reaction was more complicated. Nigeria's relationship with successful women is historically fraught. When Zainab had been building Okafor, ascending to the position of CEO, becoming the wealthiest woman in West Africa, she had been celebrated as a national asset, a symbol of what African women could achieve. Magazine covers had featured her with headlines like "She Built an Empire" and "The Queen of Tech." She had been, in the eyes of the nation, beyond reproach precisely because she had been beyond human. But the moment she'd chosen love over power, she'd become human. And being human, in the eyes of a society that demands its successful women remain untouchable, meant becoming vulnerable to judgment. There were editorials in Nigerian newspapers questioning whether her decision revealed character weakness or character strength. There were op-eds from women's rights organizations defending her right to personal happiness. There were think pieces from business professors analyzing whether emotional decisions disqualify someone from leadership. The discourse fractured along predictable lines: age, gender, economic status, personal experience with love and loss. All of these factors determined whether Zainab's choice was seen as courageous or catastrophic. In Seoul, where Min Jun had been born, and where his family still maintained a home, the reaction was almost universally negative. The Korean business community viewed his choice as a fundamental betrayal of filial duty. His father, a retired military officer, had given an interview to a Korean journalist in which he'd said, "My son has brought shame upon our family name." The statement was published globally and became a symbol of the generational and cultural divide that Min Jun had crossed. But worse than the public judgment was the private cost. 3 weeks after Zainab's resignation, Min Jun's mother had suffered a minor stroke. The doctors said it was stress-related, that the shock of the scandal had elevated her blood pressure beyond safe levels. Min Jun had flown to Seoul to be with her, and he'd sat by her hospital bed while she'd looked at him with an expression that combined love and profound disappointment in equal measure. "You were supposed to protect others," she'd said to him in Korean, her voice weak from the stroke. "That was your duty. That was what our family was built upon. And you chose." She hadn't finished the sentence. She didn't need to. They both knew what she'd chosen. Not the family legacy, not the oath, not the carefully constructed identity that had been handed down through generations of Kim men, who defined themselves entirely through the concept of protection and duty. He'd chosen a woman. An African woman. Someone from outside his culture, outside his world, outside the framework of everything his family had spent centuries understanding as sacred. The stroke, while minor, had changed something between them. His mother recovered, but the conversation they'd both understood needed to happen never took place. Instead, there was silence, the kind of silence that exists between people who love each other, but can no longer speak the same language. Zainab's family, meanwhile, had responded with surprising grace. Her mother, a woman who'd raised Zainab single-handedly after her father had abandoned them, had called immediately after the resignation announcement. "I'm proud of you," she'd said simply. "For the first time in your life, you chose something because you wanted it, not because you had to." Her extended family in Lagos had been more divided. Some had praised her for breaking with the expectation that women leaders must remain celibate on the altar of corporate success. Others had questioned whether she'd considered the impact on her younger cousins, who'd looked up to her as a model of perfection, and now had to recalibrate their understanding of what success meant. But the most immediate consequence came from the business world. Zainab discovered very quickly that stepping down from a position of power did not mean being released from responsibility. The new CEO, a woman named Chioma Adeyemi who'd been Zainab's chief financial officer, had taken the role with a clear mandate from the board: stabilize the company and protect shareholder value. This meant, among other things, making strategic decisions that would distance Okafor Tech from the scandal of its founder's personal relationship. One of those strategic decisions involved a massive contract with a Korean technology conglomerate that had been in negotiation for months. The deal was worth $2.3 billion and would have cemented Okafor Tech's position in the Asian market. But the Korean company, citing cultural alignment concerns, had requested that Min-jun be explicitly excluded from any ongoing consulting role with Okafor Tech. This was the moment when Zainab understood the true cost of their choice. It wasn't just about losing the company. It was about losing the networks, the relationships, the institutional structures that had been built over years, and that were now being systematically dismantled. The Korean company had been polite about it. They'd said that they wanted to avoid any perception of bias or cultural complications that might arise from Min-jun's involvement. In reality, they were protecting themselves from the scandal that his presence represented. If they were seen as supporting him, if they were seen as validating his choice to prioritize love over duty, then they would be associated with the same breach of cultural protocol that he'd committed. So they'd simply demanded that he disappear. And Chioma, acting in the company's interests, had accepted the condition. When Zainab had confronted her about this decision, Chioma had been professional but firm. "I don't make these decisions because I agree with them. I make them because they're what the company needs to survive. Your choice to leave was yours to make, but it created a liability that I have to manage." This was the moment when both Zainab and Min-jun truly understood what they'd sacrificed. It wasn't just their professional positions. It was the structural support system that those positions had provided. Zainab had used her CEO role to influence corporate decisions and shape industries. Min-jun had used his proximity to power to navigate a world that would have otherwise been closed to him. Now they had nothing but each other, and they had to learn to live in a world that was actively working to separate them. The media harassment had begun almost immediately. Paparazzi followed them when they tried to go to restaurants. Journalists called constantly, requesting interviews, wanting them to explain their choice, wanting details about their relationship, wanting to sell the story of their downfall as entertainment. There had been a particularly vicious piece in a London tabloid that had tracked down Min-jun's ex-wife and quoted her as saying, "He never loved me the way he loves her. But that's because he didn't know how to love anyone until he met her. That was the tragedy of my marriage. I loved a man who didn't know he could love." The quote had been published without context, in a way designed to suggest that Min-jun was incapable of genuine emotion, that what he felt for Zainab was an obsession rather than love. It had hurt both of them in different ways. For Zainab, it meant that every moment of vulnerability with Min-jun was being dissected and analyzed and weaponized. For Min-jun, it meant that the one relationship he'd tried to do right by, his marriage, was now being used to undermine the one relationship that felt true. By the third month after her resignation, Zainab had stopped reading the coverage. She'd asked Min-jun to do the same, understanding that the constant assault of external judgment was eroding their ability to trust in their own narrative. But stopping the consumption of news didn't stop the noise. The noise continued because the story continued to be valuable. A powerful African CEO and a Korean bodyguard, their forbidden love, their sacrifice. It was the kind of story that existed at the intersection of multiple cultural anxieties. About power, about race, about the appropriate boundaries of professional relationships, about whether love is worth the cost. What nobody tells you about choosing love over power is that you still have to eat. You still have bills. You still have to exist in the practical world. And the practical world has very specific requirements. 3 months after Zainab's resignation, she and Min-jun were living in a modest apartment in Lagos's Victoria Island neighborhood. Modest, at least, relative to the palatial spaces she'd inhabited before. She'd liquidated enough of her personal assets to ensure they could live comfortably for several years without income. But she was also acutely aware that money runs out. Eventually, you have to rebuild. This was when she'd started consulting. Zainab had founded a firm called Truth Advisory, which worked with technology companies on ethical frameworks and crisis management. She was brilliant at it. Companies would pay enormous fees for her insight on how to navigate the kind of scandal that had destroyed her CEO position, but hadn't destroyed her intelligence. There was, she discovered, a market for cautionary tales. There was value in hiring someone who'd paid the ultimate price for their mistakes, and could therefore speak with authority about how to avoid them. The work was good. It was honest. It allowed her to use her skills while maintaining enough distance from corporate power structures that she could preserve her sanity. But it also meant that she was, in some sense, monetizing her own fall. She was packaging her failure as wisdom and selling it to people who wanted to avoid her fate. Minjun's path to survival was more complicated. He couldn't go back to security work. No agency would hire him, not with the scandal attached to his name. He couldn't go back to Korea. His family, while supportive in their way, had made clear that his return would be conditional on his separation from Zainab. He couldn't even do simple contract work, because his presence at any company would trigger the same cultural complications that had disqualified him from the Protect deal. So he did what people do when the traditional paths are closed. He improvised. He started working with NGOs that focused on security issues in developing nations. His tactical expertise and his understanding of both Western and Korean security protocols made him valuable to organizations that were training local security forces. The work was less lucrative than his previous roles, and it required travel to places where power was unstable and danger was real. But it was work that felt, to him, like redemption. There was an irony in this that Minjun recognized acutely. He'd sacrificed his career and personal security to be with Zainab, and he'd ended up in a career that was, in many ways, more dangerous. He was regularly in environments where kidnapping, assault, and violence were genuine possibilities. He was living with a level of threat that made his old job protecting Zainab look like a vacation by comparison. But the work gave him purpose. It gave him a reason to exist that didn't depend on proximity to power. And it gave him something to build. A professional identity that was separate from his relationship with Zainab, which was essential for maintaining the boundaries that any long-term relationship requires. Zainab understood this, though it cost her something to accept it. Every time Minjun left for a 2-week assignment in Sierra Leone, or the Democratic Republic of Congo, she felt the weight of his absence in a way that she'd never felt about her CEO role. She'd built a company as an act of self-preservation, something she could control and depend upon. But she couldn't control Minjun's safety when he was thousands of miles away, working in situations where her wealth and influence meant nothing. This was the bargain she'd made, though she hadn't fully understood it when she'd made it. She'd chosen a person instead of a company. A person is infinitely more fragile than a company. A person can be hurt. A person can leave. A person can die. The fight for survival became, then, a fight to maintain faith in that choice when the evidence was constantly suggesting that it had been foolish. By the 8-month mark, the media cycle had begun to lose interest. The scandal was old news. There were other stories now. A coup in a neighboring country, a financial crisis in another region, the endless parade of human dramas that consume and then discard attention. Zainab and Minjun were no longer front-page news. They were yesterday's story. And this, paradoxically, was when their real struggle began. When you're living through a scandal, there's a narrative to cling to. You're the hero of your own story, or you're the villain, or you're the victim, but you're in the story. The world is watching. Your choices matter because they're being witnessed. But when the world stops watching, you're left alone with just yourself and the other person, and you have to answer a question that's far more difficult than any external pressure can create. Is this actually what you wanted? For Zainab, the answer was complicated. She loved Minjun. She was certain of that. But she also missed the structure of her life as CEO. She missed having a clear purpose, a defined role, something that gave shape and meaning to her days. Consulting was fulfilling, but it was also diffuse. She wasn't building anything anymore. She was advising other people on how to build things. She was, in the most fundamental sense, on the outside looking in. She'd wake up sometimes in the early morning, 4:47 a.m., the time she'd used to arrive at the office, and she'd feel a phantom ache, the ghost of her previous life, the person she'd been when she'd been necessary in a specific and measurable way. Minyoon noticed this. Of course he noticed this. One morning, he'd made her coffee at 4:45 a.m., and when she'd come out of the bedroom, confused about why he was awake, he'd said simply, "You miss it." "No," she'd lied. "You miss being essential," he'd continued, ignoring the lie. "You miss being the person everyone depends on. You miss the clarity of knowing exactly what your value is." "Don't," she'd said. "I'm not judging you. I'm saying that I understand. I miss those things too." This was the moment when they'd had the conversation they'd been avoiding since the resignation. Not the grand conversation about whether their choice had been worth it, but the smaller, more devastating conversation about the reality of what they'd chosen. "I gave up everything for you," Zainab had said, and the moment the words were out of her mouth, she'd understood how dangerous they were. "I know," Minjoon had replied, "and I will spend every day trying to be worthy of that. But I can't. No one can be worthy of that sacrifice. No person can carry that weight. And if you spend the rest of your life waiting for me to somehow validate your choice, we're both going to suffer." This was the moment when both of them understood that their love story had moved into a different phase. The romantic phase, the phase where love was the answer to every question, had ended. Now they were in the practical phase, the phase where love had to coexist with regret, with longing, with the acknowledgement that every choice eliminates other possibilities. Zainab had started a new company after that conversation. Not another Okafor Tech. She would never try to replicate that again. But a smaller venture focused on mentoring young African entrepreneurs, particularly women. It was meaningful work, and it gave her a reason to wake up at 4:47 a.m. again, even though there was no office waiting for her. Minjoon had taken on a more visible role with his NGO, eventually becoming the director of security operations for their African division. It was prestigious, in its way, though in a completely different category than his previous work. Instead of protecting one woman's power, he was helping to protect vulnerable populations from violence. The work was less glamorous but infinitely more important. And they had built a life. Not the life they'd originally had or the life they'd sacrificed to create, but a life that was honest. A life where they could acknowledge that they'd made a choice and that the choice had cost them, but that they'd also gained something that neither of them had possessed before. The experience of being truly seen by another human being. 2 years after Zainab's resignation from Okafor Tech, the company went through its most difficult period since her departure. The new CEO, Chioma Adeyemi, had made a series of strategic decisions that, while financially sound in the short term, had positioned Okafor Tech as a follower rather than a leader in technological innovation. The stock had stabilized, but growth had stalled. Investors were beginning to question whether the company had lost something essential when Zainab had left. Not just her leadership, but her vision. The willingness to take risks that bordered on recklessness. The capacity to imagine possibilities that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional wisdom. A group of major investors had approached Zainab privately and asked if she would consider returning as CEO. It was a moment that tested everything they'd built. Because the offer came with an implicit condition. Minjoon would need to step back. The investors weren't crude about it. They didn't explicitly say that his presence would complicate things. But the message was clear. They would support her return if, and only if, she returned alone. Zainab had sat with this offer for 3 days without telling Minjoon. On the 4th day, she'd brought it to him. Not as a question or a proposal, but as a fact that needed to be discussed. "You should do it," Minjoon had said immediately. "I haven't told you what I'm thinking." "I don't need to know what you're thinking. I know what you're feeling. You're feeling like you're standing at a crossroads, and on one side is the company you built and the person you were when you built it, and on the other side is me, and you're trying to figure out how to have both." "I don't want to go back," Zainab had said, "but I also don't want to regret this for the rest of my life." "Then we need to make a choice together," Minjoon had said. "But you need to understand that if you choose to go back, if you choose to rebuild your empire, I can't come with you. Not in the way I came before. Because the company will require your undivided attention. It will require you to be someone who can't have a personal life, can't have a relationship, can't have anyone close to her. There has to be another way. There isn't, he'd said. Not in the world that we live in. Women leaders aren't allowed the luxury of being human in the way that men leaders are. If you want to rebuild Okafor, you have to accept that you'll have to rebuild yourself into someone perfect again. And I can't be the person who loves the perfect version of you. I can only love the human version. The one with doubts and fears and limitations. This was the moment when their love faced its final test. Not because external pressure was forcing them apart, but because one of them wanted something that the other couldn't provide while remaining themselves. Zainab had turned down the offer. The decision had been simple, once she'd understood what accepting it would require. She'd chosen her mentoring work. She'd chosen her consulting. She'd chosen a life of meaning that was smaller in scope than her CEO role, but larger in authenticity. She'd chosen to be a person rather than an icon. But she also understood that she was choosing this because Minjun had given her permission to want something other than power. Before their relationship had forced her to confront her own humanity, she would have done whatever was necessary to reclaim Okafor. She would have sacrificed anything. The fact that she could now choose not to sacrifice everything was a kind of freedom that she'd never experienced before. What emerged from this period was a redefinition of what success meant for both of them. For Zainab, success was no longer measured in market capitalization or the number of employees she controlled or the geographical extent of her empire. Success was measured in the quality of the companies she mentored, in the young entrepreneurs she taught to think about business ethics as something inseparable from business strategy, in the students who went out into the world believing that it was possible to build something meaningful without destroying yourself in the process. For Minjun, success was measured in lives saved, in security protocols developed, in the communities he'd helped train to protect themselves from violence. It was measured in the quiet moments when he'd see a young security officer he'd trained stand up to corruption, choose integrity over career advancement, and Minjun understood that he'd passed something forward, not just tactical knowledge, but a philosophy of what protection actually means. The enduring legacy of their choice began to manifest in unexpected ways. 3 years after Zainab's resignation, a documentary filmmaker had approached them about making a film about their story. They'd initially refused, protective of their privacy, unwilling to have their relationship commodified again. But the filmmaker had been persistent, and eventually they'd agreed to participate. Not to tell their love story, but to tell the story about how their choice had rippled through multiple industries and cultures. The documentary had premiered at the Toronto International Film Festival. It was titled The Cost of Authenticity, and it was not a love story. It was a meditation on power, on sacrifice, on what it means to choose humanity over empire in a world that consistently devalues that choice. In the documentary, Zainab spoke about the moment she'd understood that building a company was not actually the same as building a life. She spoke about how she'd constructed her identity entirely around the idea of never being vulnerable, never being dependent on another person, never allowing anyone close enough to hurt her. And she spoke about how Minjun had forced her, by simply existing in her life, to confront the question of whether a life built on the absolute elimination of vulnerability is actually a life at all. Minjun spoke about duty and how duty can become a prison if you're not careful. He spoke about the way his culture and his training had taught him that his value lay entirely in his capacity to be useful to others, to suppress his own desires in service of a larger cause. And he spoke about how Zainab had forced him, by asking him to choose her, to confront the question of whether a life lived entirely in service of others is any different from slavery, no matter how noble the cause. But the most powerful part of the documentary came not from interviews, but from the work they were doing. The film showed Zainab in her mentoring sessions, teaching a young entrepreneur from Kano about the long-term consequences of cutting corners on product development. It showed Minjun training a group of security officers in Lagos about how to recognize when a client was in distress, and how to respond with compassion rather than just tactical precision. What became clear in watching their work was that they hadn't stopped building. They just shifted what they were building. Instead of building for power, they were building for meaning. Instead of building for themselves, they were building for the people around them. The documentary had a profound impact on the discourse around work, leadership, and the meaning of success. It became a text cited in business schools and ethics courses. It was written about in major publications, not as a scandal anymore, but as a case study in the redefinition of professional success. But more importantly, it gave other people permission to question their own assumptions about what they were supposed to want. Women watching the documentary reported that it had changed their thinking about ambition and success. Men watching it reported that it had challenged their understanding of what vulnerability means, and whether it's actually possible to build meaningful relationships while maintaining traditional ideas about masculinity and duty. The most significant change, though, came in how Zainab and Minjun were perceived in their respective cultures. In Nigeria, Zainab's choice began to be recontextualized not as a failure of leadership, but as a redefinition of it. The narrative shifted from powerful woman throws away her empire, to powerful woman recognizes that empire is not the same as meaning and makes a different choice. Young Nigerian women began to see her as a symbol not of what you could achieve through sacrifice, but of what you could achieve through authenticity. In Korea, Minjun's choice began to be understood differently as well. The idea that he'd chosen love over duty began to be seen, by some, as a higher form of duty. Duty to himself, duty to his own humanity, duty to the person he loved rather than to abstract concepts of honor and family obligation. It was a slow shift, and his father never fully came around, but by the time Minjun's mother passed away, 5 years after his choice, she had written him a letter that he found among her things. The letter said simply, "I was wrong. You are my son because of your courage, not because of your obedience." By the time they reached their 5th anniversary of stepping away from their respective roles, Zainab and Minjun had built a life that would have seemed impossible at the moment they'd made their choice. They were no longer famous. The scandal had faded enough that they could walk through markets in Lagos without being recognized. Their relationship was no longer a topic of international commentary. In the best possible way, they had become boring. They were just a couple, trying to build something meaningful, struggling with the daily challenges that all relationships face, nothing more remarkable than that. But they carried with them an understanding that had come from their choice. That love and meaning don't come from the size of your empire, or the scope of your influence. They come from the quality of your presence with another human being. They come from the decision to see and be seen. They come from the willingness to choose authenticity over perfection. Every single day, even when the world is telling you that perfection is the only thing that matters. The story of the African CEO and her Korean bodyguard had transformed from a scandal into a legend. And the legend had become something neither of them had expected. Not a warning about the dangers of choosing love over power, but a testament to the freedom that comes from choosing meaning over achievement. In the end, Zainab had not lost everything. She had lost a company, but she had found a life. She had lost an empire, but she had gained the experience of being loved for who she was rather than what she'd built. She had made the ultimate sacrifice, and she had discovered that the ultimate sacrifice was not as devastating as she'd feared, because what she'd gained was more valuable than anything she'd lost. And Minjun, who'd spent his entire life being taught that his value lay in his utility, in his capacity to protect and serve and suppress his own desire, had discovered that his greatest act of protection was not the bullets he'd stopped or the threats he'd prevented. It was the moment he'd decided to show up as a complete human being rather than as an instrument of duty. The enduring legacy of their story is this. In a world that consistently teaches us to choose power over humanity, to choose empire over love, to choose the appearance of perfection over the reality of authenticity, there are still people willing to choose differently. And that choice, while it comes at an enormous cost, opens up possibilities that a life built entirely on ambition and duty can never access. Their story teaches us that breaking societal norms is not always an act of rebellion. Sometimes it's an act of alignment. Alignment with your own humanity, with what you actually value, with the person you want to become. And sometimes, the greatest risk you can take is not the risk that leads to power, but the risk that leads to love.